Domestic violence, narrative number 2. I'm fighting for people. Unfortunately, in my experience, the judgment and the words of the other people that you are disclosing to are taken considerably more seriously than in the survivors, than the victim. And so if that person does not believe you or doesn't take you seriously, they're kind of setting you up for failure for the rest of the battle, however long that goes. Implications of stigma. I think a large thing to overcome when dealing with the repercussions of domestic violence and sexual assault is that you kind of have to jump through a lot of hoops to get treatment, to get help, regardless if you're living with the perpetrators or not. It's still very difficult to find resources, and it's very difficult to know where to start when you're trying to get help. And I'm, again, fortunate in the sense that I do not live with my perpetrator. But I can understand that people, those who do, have an extra, very terrifying hurdle in having to really, really be secretive and attempt to get help in the clandestine manner. And another thing that is a massive hurdle is that there's still that stigma around domestic violence. There's still stigma around sexual assault. I would argue, especially in Oklahoma. So when you do need to disclose that situation in order to get assistance, be it medical or mental or anything like that, it's almost scary. Like, we talk about the hit or miss, whether your provider is going to take you seriously or be compassionate and understanding. And it's scary to have to disclose that, to say a nurse and then in a hospital or something like that, because you don't know how they're going to react and if you'll get this treatment or you'll get the consideration that you need, that you deserve. Healthcare interactions. I'm very fortunate that I've had health insurance, and I'm very, very grateful because I know that is a very privileged situation, and that for a lot of people, and a lot of people close to me, that's not the case. But as far, even with insurance, the interactions with people are very interesting. After my assault, when I was worried about stuff like that, I went to Planned Parenthood, but it was still very hush-hush, kind of like go through the back door type of situation. And separately, I went to an older male doctor for a pulmonologist appointment or whatever, and it was interesting, the kind of difference in the interaction and the more paternal kind of, I don't know how to explain it exactly, but the almost dismissal of the concern that I went there for, as opposed to my primary doctor, who is a woman. I'm very fortunate that I don't go to the doctor very often, but when I had an emergency several years ago, and I finally got a doctor, and I spoke with her, and she actually listened to me, and I feel heard with her. And I feel like healthcare, or at least practitioners in Oklahoma, again, in my limited experience, but as with talking with my friends as well, kind of hit or miss whether you're taken seriously. Impacts of a global pandemic. Well, of course, a major one was the lockdown situation. You are with the perpetrator a lot more often. And not only just time-wise, you guys together, more you know, tensions run high. There's the anxiety of a global pandemic. There's the anxiety or the stress of being kind of confined to your house. There's this agitation from added rules and regulations to your everyday life. It's just a change. and a massive change in that way that affects all aspects of life, and that causes stress and or anxiety, which, you know, does not mesh well together with two people who are stuck in the same situation, and especially if they have different viewpoints or reactions to it. So situations like global pandemic or something that is so universally stressful raises tension and also increases that. That time spent together means that, you have a greater risk of harm being done, and you have a lower risk of being able to get help because, you're, like hospitals have regulations, for good reasons, but you can't have a support person with you to go to the hospital. So you will face if you get medical treatment, you have to face that medical treatment alone. And I had to do that. It is very, very terrifying. And it is very upsetting to not be able to have support system with you. So that fear of having to go about, if you decide to go that route, the fear of having to do that alone, it can sometimes be a make or break mentally for you. And sometimes it's just like, oh, forget it. I'm going to face it alone. I'm going to face it alone here without having to, talk to other people about it, about this, strangers. Addressing issues within the system. I hate to sound so negative, but the system is kind of really stacked against you as a victim. And it really is. You don't have a say, even if something goes to court, for example, which mine did not. It's the state versus the defendant, not the victim. And for criminal prosecution, for criminal charges, and so you have other person, some prosecutor who's supposed to be for the people, representing the people. And honestly, in my experience, this is not the case. But that kind of just structure completely undermines the criminal justice system. You're not getting justice if it's inconvenient. So really, what is justice in that situation? And I think that, unfortunately, that's putting a lot of burden on the victim, the survivor who has already experienced this tremendous trauma. And we have to advocate for ourselves. And I've personally I try not to ruffle any feathers. I don't want to, make any noise. I usually try to be very go with the flow. But I've realized after being failed, and again, I'm saying this as a working in the criminal justice system, which is depressing. I was failed at every single step of the way. And the only reason I was able to recognize that is because I had the formal training that, hey, this is not how this is supposed to go. I know that you're supposed to do more of an investigation than the one call. In my case, the 2 calls, the 2 interviews, and then calling it quits. And I was literally told, oh, sorry, your case fell through the cracks. Now, I knew the timeline because, again, I've studied this. And that's a very, very privileged situation that I was able to recognize that because of that. And that has continuously been so depressing because how many other women, how many other victims have had their cases treated like this and not realize that that's not supposed to go that way? There should have been more of an investigation. There should have been more than the bare minimum done in cases like this. And it's taken me personally a long time of processing. And I realize that I've been fighting for something to happen in my case for over 365 days. And I'm going to the law library during my lunch break. And I'm doing legal research in my free time. I'm trying desperately to find these avenues and argue the fundamental rights that I should be afforded. The standards the prosecutors are supposed to be held to. The Bar Association's rules and regulations, and compiling my own evidence because the investigators did not. I had a bunch of text messages that were related, and when I was asked why initially the case was declined, I asked why. Why wasn't my outcry witnesses interviewed? Why weren't the text messages looked at? And they're like, "Oh, outcry witness? You know what that meant?" And so kind of implying like I've done this before or something like that. And then asked about the text messages, "Why weren't these looked at?" They're like, "Well, you're telling me an experienced detective would not have asked for your phone?" I'm like, "I don't know what to tell you. They didn't." And so I've had to spend hours combing through months and months of messages of highlighting these things that are relevant to the situation. I have an accordion folder of my fake case file. That burden of investigation should not have to be put on me, being re-traumatized along the way. And it shouldn't have to be put on anyone to just get the bare minimum of what our justice system is supposed to be there for. I've had to make myself have a voice, which I never usually do. And it is liberating because I'm fighting for what is supposed to happen. I'm fighting for people to do their jobs and to do them correctly as they're supposed to, and not just dismiss any concerns, but also bring light to these kinds of shortcomings. I think that what I've seen is that a lot of the reason why cases get declined to be prosecuted is for delayed disclosure. And I think that it should not be as big of a consideration or a consideration at all, because we know that happens so often in domestic violence and sexual assault cases. Like, that is statistically very common. And to not prosecute or not even bother investigating because someone didn't call 911 right then, it is kind of a slap in the face to victims. And another thing that I strongly believe in is that people who are working in the criminal justice system, especially prosecutors and even judges who are making these major decisions, need to have more mandated training on trauma and how that affects the brain. And if they have these outdated views of, well, she waited, so, she must have been formulating a story in that time or something like that. Because a lot of the reason why there is a delayed disclosure is that there's that fear of repercussion. It's like, I can't believe this has happened to me. And that is a major thing, like that it takes days or weeks, sometimes years to process the severity of what has happened to you. The system is kind of really stacked against you as a victim. Also, ideally, and this is coming from a criminal justice kind of academic, I suppose, but ideally, I think prosecutorial discretion needs to have a little bit more advanced. I don't know, want to say regulation, but kind of oversight. Because in my experience, both personally and studying prosecutorial discretion disproportionately affects sexual violence cases and domestic violence cases because they're complicated and they're not always cut and dry. And so I see a lot of prosecutors decline to investigate, or investigators decline to investigate, because they'll be in the mindset of, well, it's not worth it because it's just going to be too complex. So we're not going to bother. And I think that and many other factors in the criminal justice system and the reporting process really dehumanizes the victims and the person who has experienced it. Yes, we need due process. Yes, we need fundamental fairness and defendants, and everyone involved needs to, have their rights accommodated, of course. But the victims are not really involved at all. And the victims are not really given consideration at all, even just in the case process. And a major, major issue that I know, the thing in Oklahoma is that we have victims' rights on the books, okay? But they don't really apply unless charges are formally filed with the courts. And people need to be more aware of the ramifications of not having that consideration, both mentally, physically, emotionally, and just statistically. Takeaway thoughts. What I want to say to people, and this is way, way easier said than done, and I know this from experience, is that if you can, if you so mentally able to do so, follow up, take notes, write down the conversations you have and who you had them with and the content of it with, your investigator or any sort of agency that you interact with, because our system needs more accountability. And so I think fighting for that is extraordinarily difficult, and it is at times mentally draining. But there needs to be more awareness of how victims are being treated. And it's hard to speak up about something that is so personal and so, upsetting. And I don't know that I could, and not everyone can. But the people in charge or the communities of these counties need to know how their investigators, how their court system treats these types of cases. And we should be considered fairly because we are people and members of society. What if this happened to your mother, your sister, your daughter? Will that make you care about this more? It shouldn't. But you should care that this is how things are happening. And you wouldn't wish this complete disregard almost for these types of cases for anyone. And so I think we really need to wait to raise awareness. I think that the people who are working in the field, who are making these major decisions, need to be more informed of trauma responses and these types of situations. And I say this, that again, working in the field, in my field, I read a lot of police reports, a lot of court documents. I've seen more follow-up investigation for larceny of like a leaf blower. I've seen more follow-up investigation in a simple, very, very small theft charge than in my rape investigation. And so seeing that disparity, like our citizens need to know that. Our state needs to know that this is how things are being treated. And we need to know that impacts everybody. And the prosecutors need to know how that impacts everybody. I'm still following up and fighting, kind of, to have my case heard. So I'm finding avenues, and I just hate that it has to come to this. And I would not wish it on any other person. But I know that it is impacting so many people, or so many people are in the same boat as me. And that's just depressing. I just feel for everybody, and I hope that we'll see some sort of recognition, at the very least, and a very slow, gradual change.